Well, good morning to each and every one of you. Thank you for being here today. If you're a guest, we want you to know that we are so delighted that you're here, and we hope that you can come back and be with us sometime, and sometime very, very soon. If you don't know the story of Joseph, it is in Genesis chapter 37 through 50. And I'm not going to retell the story. I'm throwing this out there because there's a possibility that there are people here that don't know that story. You may want to go home and refresh your memory on it. That's what I'm speaking on this morning, and I'm just kind of skimming over the story and drawing a few lessons from it. The reason I'm doing this is a couple of weeks ago, I preached on Jacob and Esau, and a couple of the Sunday school teachers let me know that that's what the young people in their class were studying, and it just reaffirmed what they were hearing, and they paid attention to the sermon because they knew the story. And so I thought, well, I'll try it again and preach on the same thing that they're studying. And I'm excited that our young people were listening, and probably noticed that in my stumbling around, I might have said Jacob when I meant Esau, and Esau when I meant Jacob, and Isaac. And those names kind of get tricky when you're up here trying to think ahead. But anyway, that's what we'll be doing this morning. But before that, I want to make an announcement concerning praying for a family. A person that works with Wayne, Jim Curry, has a 14-year-old daughter named Megan, and she has been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and hospice has been brought in, and they're only giving her a few weeks at the most. And we want to remember the Curry family and think of that terrible loss that they're facing, the terrible struggle that they are now enduring and will endure. So if you would, please pray for them as the weeks go on. Family harmony is a treasure, and it's a treasure that often eludes us. No family that I know of has perfect and continuous harmony. And that's even true in the Bible. One of my favorite sermons is a survey of the families in the Bible, in which I draw the conclusion there's no such thing as a perfect family. I'd like to preach that this morning, but I'm going to stick with Joseph and kind of use that story. You know, it's kind of sad when you consider the human race and how we have operated throughout the centuries. You've got Adam and Eve starting out, and I can never get over this fact that it just seems so incredible to me that you have a man and woman in paradise. They've got everything they need, and yet they are still able to feel a lack of contentment. But in that setting, when they sin, you've got Eve blaming the serpent, you've got Adam blaming Eve, and I don't know about y'all, but in my home, there have been numerous times in which we played the blame game, and we didn't want to accept blame. Now, I don't know about you, but as far as I know, those things rarely get settled in a way that just everybody feels satisfied with the results. Because you hate to admit blame, and so if you admit it, you still deep down know that the other person was at least partly at fault. Y'all know how that works. I mean, but you give up the fight, but there's that little bit of resentment where you really want somebody to take some of the responsibility, and you don't have to bear it all alone. Then you've got Cain and Abel, and what a tragic story that is, and I'm not even going into any details on that one, but good grief, two brothers, and such a terrible outcome for both of those brothers. Then you've got Jacob and Esau that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, and it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around the fact that with all of the troubles that goes on between Jacob and Esau, it is the guy that ends up being the good guy that caused most of the problems that they ever had. Got old Jacob stealing from his brother every turn that he gets. He's just a crooked guy. And he ends up being converted, and he ends up being a better man. But he's the one that created most of the problems. And poor Esau, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but he looks like he's dumb as a rock. But he ends up being a fellow that is quick to forgive, and you got to give him that as a good mark, right? I mean, that's a great quality. But here they are, brothers fighting in the same household. And I don't know whether this has ever happened to you. By the way, the story of Jacob and Esau is a good story in that it has a reconciliation at the end. And you got to love that after all the troubles that they had, they end up making up. And I like those stories where people end up making up and settling their differences. I think of one particular woman that I love. Oh, I still miss her, and she's been gone a long time. I love this woman. Now she was a hard woman in many ways. Cantankerous. If you don't know what that means, look it up in Southern English. But anyway, she was pretty cantankerous. I loved her. I never wanted to get on the wrong side of her. And I never did that I know of. And I have a feeling with the way she was, I would have known for sure I was on the wrong side. But here's what happened in this lady's life that really I'm thinking about this morning. She and her sister got crossways over an inheritance from their mother. Now, their mother had basically nothing. But when her mother passed and things were distributed out, the family, the brothers and sisters got crossways fighting over stuff. Now, things don't have to be of great value monetarily. Sometimes they can be of great value sentimentally, and that would have been the case. And this woman and her sister got so angry at each other that they went for like 20 years without speaking to each other. And I don't care how you view it. I view it as a tragedy when siblings are not speaking to each other. But the grand thing is that it ends up being a story of reconciliation in that I don't know what triggered it, but they ended up getting together. They ended up burying the hatchet. They ended up forgiving each other. And both of them died within 6 months of them making peace. I'm glad that they made peace before they died. But sibling rivalry is a monster sometimes that invades their homes. In fact, I have a feeling that if you have more than one child, you understand sibling rivalry. Y'all remember the days back before we got so wealthy that every child had their own bedroom? Back in the days when you had to share beds. Y'all remember those days? And you would play this little game where your little brother or your big brother or whoever was sharing the bed with you, and you would draw this line down the bed. Y'all remember that? Draw the line down the bed and say, "This is my side, don't touch my side." And you know good and well that was a challenge thrown down that had to be accepted, that had to be violated, and so your little brother or whoever would stick his foot across or he would run his hand across. And I don't think this is the way that most brothers and sisters operate, but in my family, that ended up, blows were passed before it was over because they had violated my space. And at times, it just gets pretty vicious. Or maybe since most of us live in a house now where we have our own bedrooms, that we're riding down the road in the car, and this is my side of the car. And you better not stick your hand on my side of the car. And I guarantee you, most parents in here that have more than one child has heard this coming from the back seat. "Stop touching me! Stop touching me! He won't quit touching me." And we can look at that and laugh at it when it's not happening to us, but when we're in the middle of it, Tell me y'all haven't had violent thoughts towards your children. Good grief. And tell us that you wouldn't speak to them in church the way you do to them when it's nobody but you and them. I'm not saying you say ugly words. I'm saying you just make threats that you wouldn't want social services to hear. Right? I'm going to pull this car over and beat both of y'all to death. I mean, maybe something like that. I don't know. And then there's this great joy that says, okay, you think about this, how we fight over possessions at such an early age. Don't play with my toy. Don't come into my room. Now, it's just amazing. Here's a toy that maybe it's the oldest child hadn't touched in 2 years. But then the younger one comes in and starts playing with it. War is on over my possessions. Sad stuff. And then, I have 4 grandsons, but 3 by Wade. And my oldest grandson, it took a long time. They tried to figure out whether or not he had autism, but I think he's just majorly OCD. And Thomas oh mercy, I got so tired of Thomas the Train. Every present he got was Thomas the Train, and they all had to be lined up perfectly. And if one of them got out of line, he knew somebody had messed with his trains. And war was on. And I'm telling you folks, there was enough Thomas the Trains and all of those other little trains in his room, you would think there was no way humanly possible that he would ever miss one, but walk in the room, boom, somebody's got my train. Isn't that sad that we do that? And aren't you glad, and I know some of you are struggling with this now, aren't you glad that there's this great hope that one of these days they're going to really be good friends? It's hard to imagine that. But that is the way that it turns out for most of us. We end up loving each other. We end up looking back and remembering mostly the good times, not the little petty fights that we had growing up. So parents, there is hope. It is going to get better, but it's going to take a while. And then when you're gray-headed or bald-headed, as in my case, and you get to sit back and you get to enjoy listening to your kids talk to each other civilly, you get to listen to them laugh together, and then they start having kids and you get to watch all this nonsense all over again. But fortunately, grandkids go home and you don't have to deal with it. Well, in the story of Joseph, you've got some sibling rivalry it's not funny. You've got Joseph, who no doubt, and again, I'm just referencing the story, and you read it if you don't know it, Genesis 37 through 50. You've got probably one of the best characters in the Bible, best human beings. He's just outstanding in basically every way. Now, there is one thing that he seems to do that is an annoying thing. And I don't know whether he's wrong in it or right in it, but he seems to be a tattletale, at least early on. Now, I learned 2 things. There's a great book, if you've never read it, there's a great book, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. That's an old book, but if you've never read it, you ought to find it and read it. We didn't have kindergarten, so I learned a few valuable lessons from the first grade, Miss Nix. And one of the lessons that I learned was that I hated this rule, but this is the one that we lived by in the first grade: finders, weepers, finders, keepers, losers. I hated that rule because I can't keep up with anything, and I sure don't want, if somebody finds something I lost, I want them to bring it back to me. And I try to do the same thing. Now, that's rule number 1 that I learned. Rule number 2 is you don't tattle. And there's this great little song, and I'm terrible at poems and songs, and when I'm up here thinking ahead, I always get them mixed up, but we used to sing this little song about tattletale, hang your britches on a nail. Y'all know that one? Hang 'em high, hang 'em low, hang 'em in a picture show. That's the way we learned it. Y'all know that one? Now, I don't want to leave the impression that we don't need to report crime. I don't want to leave that impression, but it is something that is very irritating when you have a person that is always tattling. But the problem really is not so much with the child, I think, as it is with the parent. Because if your child is always telling you stuff on the others and you react, you're empowering that child in a bad way. Because that child is creating unnecessary drama a lot of times. And by your coming to their rescue, you are just reinforcing that and there may be something a little bit sinister in that when you're a tattletale, in that you like to see other people punished. Now, kids, I'm talking mainly to you, but I'm hoping some parents are listening, that whenever you've got a child that is always telling on others, you may have, and you come to their age, you might have a little problem with self-righteousness, and you're creating that in your child as well. And you've got to come to terms with the reality, parents. Your children have the ability to shape a story in their favor all the time. And if you buy into it all the time, then you're pretty gullible. And you may buy into it because you like drama yourself. So don't encourage it. Don't always excuse your children's actions. Sometimes they're wrong. You were. I am. But Joseph, so I don't know how much. I may be making too much out of that, but it is something that bothers me about him. Now, Joseph is given dreams by God. And it speaks of his future glory. God had a plan for Joseph. Now, his brothers didn't like to hear about these plans that God had. They didn't like to hear about the fact that they were going to end up bowing down to their brother. They grew to resent him, and resentment. And by the way, jealousy is involved here. And jealousy and resentment can often turn into hatred. I've seen it. I've seen it progress. I'm not saying I've seen it in my own life, but I'm sure that it probably is true. But it's always easier, isn't it, to see other people's faults than it is our own. But I've seen this resentment and jealousy, and by the way, most people won't admit to jealousy, but I've seen that grow into hatred and what hatred can do. And there's not much good that comes out of hatred unless it is hatred of sin. Now, his brothers, they resent that. Now, here's something that they didn't realize is God had a plan for them, and it was a plan for good, right? And that's true of all of you. That's true of me. I don't know what God's plan is for me, but God has a plan for each one of us, and it is a plan, it is His desire that we end up being blessed, that we end up being in a relationship with Him. It's a great plan. Now, He may have a bigger plan for somebody else. And that was the case with Joseph. So Joseph's brothers let this resentment and jealousy grow until their hatred, till they want to kill him. That's sad, isn't it? Hey, it's just no, I would say it's unimaginable, but seems like we have some kind of crazy stuff happens every day in our country. Things that are now dulling our senses to where we're no longer as moved by the violence going on as we once were. But anyway, Joseph's brothers decide to kill him, and one of them has a good heart. One of them says, let's don't kill him. Let's don't kill him. Another one says, well, let's throw him over here in this cistern, and we'll keep him there, and we'll think about it. And then lo and behold, here comes some people down the road, and it's a traveling caravan, and they say, well, let's sell him into slavery. They sell their brother into slavery. Now, you know the story. Joseph goes through a whole lot of difficult times. First of all, he's a servant in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife won't leave him alone. He ends up doing the right thing, gets in trouble, ends up in prison, serves time in prison. Now, I want you to think about this, folks. Think about how difficult it would be to maintain a good attitude when you're doing the right thing and bad things keep happening to you. That's difficult, isn't it? I mean, most of us have a hard time keeping a good attitude when everything is running smooth. But here's a man that keeps a good attitude even though bad things keep happening to him when he's doing the right thing. He keeps this great, wonderful attitude. And God is with him. And I guarantee if I'm in prison and somebody walks up and says, God is with you, I'd say, well, wouldn't God and I be a little bit happier if we were in a different place together? Because we want to dictate to God how He works and when He works. And don't always trust that God is at work. Get that one, write that down. We don't always trust that God is at work. Now, the day comes, right, when Joseph has reached this new height. The vice president, the prime minister of Egypt, and his brothers show up. He could have every one of them beheaded, right? He could have had every one of them thrown in prison. Now, he does mess with them a little bit. And I kind of like that, to be honest. But when Joseph finally says, okay, you don't know who I am, I'm your brother. They're scared. They think he's going to kill us. But he ends up forgiving them. Man, that is a thing of beauty. I don't know if this will apply to anybody in here, but if you got problems in your family and in your extended family, forgiveness is this wonderful thing that ought to be extended. Yes, we get on each other's nerves, don't we? Yes, we love everybody, but the truth is we don't like everybody, and I think that's okay, but we've got to love everybody. And we also know that if we want to be forgiven, guess what we have to do? We have to forgive. Now, the law of restitution. Law of restitution. Now, this is a sermon in and of itself. Some of you have never even heard this phrase. The law of restitution is a grand thing. The law of restitution says if you steal something from me, then when you repent, you pay me back, and really you pay me back more than you stole. That's a good law. The law of restitution says you restore that which I've taken from you. You fix the problem as much as you can that you have created. That's the law of restitution. But we all know something is true about the law of restitution. We just don't apply it to every situation. You cannot restore the years that Joseph spent in prison, can you? If his brothers wrote him out a check, how much would that check be for that would pay for the years of difficulty that he suffered? You know, our government, our prison system is faced with realizing they've had the wrong person in jail for 20 and 30 years, and they set them free and they give them a new suit of clothes. How much is 20 or 30 years in prison worth? I don't care if they wrote you a check for $100 million. That doesn't give you the years back, right? You can't make up for that. Joseph's brothers could not make up for the time that Joseph was spent away from his daddy, from his brothers. Joseph's brothers could not make up to Jacob the grief that he felt when he thought his son was dead, and spending those years without a sense of closure. So what do you do when you can't pay people back? Or let me turn this around. Turn that phrase around. When somebody has wronged you, can they restore everything in every way that makes up for the wrong? No. Now, this is serious stuff, what I'm about to say. But sometimes our spouses wrong us. Can they go back and change the wrong? No. We have to forgive. Sometimes your sibling may do things that causes you heartache. They can't go back and fix everything. You have to forgive. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 15, verse 13. Listen to this. You don't have to turn there. Bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, and by the way, it would be perfectly legitimate if it was translated, if anyone has a just complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Do you think that Joseph ever had to battle a little bit of resentment when he's sitting there in a position of power? He saved his family, but he has to check on the prisons, and he remembers his time there. I'm sure that there was a little bit of resentment there that'd flare up every once in a while. And I'm not saying that you and I can pretend that we haven't been hurt. I'm not saying that we're not going to feel a little bit of resentment, but here's the truth of the matter. We can't let resentment reside in our heart, because it will turn into jealousy, which will turn into hate, which causes us to sin. And so, as hard as it is, when people have wronged us, we are to forgive. And we have a wonderful story in the Bible that illustrates that. In Luke 15, you have two boys. One of the boys says to his father, "Give me my inheritance, I want it now." And he gets his inheritance, and he goes out and he lives like the world. He spends his money, he throws it around, he has big parties, he just lives it up. And then there's a day that he finds himself flat broke and his friends have deserted him. And his companions are now pigs. He's got a job feeding the pigs, and he would like to eat just the husk off the grain that he feeds the pigs. And he's there and he's sitting there and he's thinking, how foolish I've been. My father's servants have it better off than I have it. I'm going to go back to my father and I'm going to say to him, I have sinned. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Just let me be a servant in your house. And he marches back, or maybe he staggers back because he's weak and tired and he's got shame all over him, and he ought to have, by the way. And he comes back and he's got his little speech prepared. And now watch this. He comes back and he looks up and he says, "Father, I have sinned. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Let me be a servant." Does the father have the right to say, "You got that right. You have sinned against me. You have shamed me. You have wasted my money. You're right. You're not worthy to be my servant. I'm not letting you be my servant. I'm not having you back. He could have said that, couldn't he? But you know the story. The father saw his son afar off and ran and hugged him and kissed him and told his servants, go kill the fatted calf. We're about to have a feast. My son, it was dead, it's now alive. My son, it was lost, is now found. That's the way God is willing to do you. You see, all of us get offended. All of us are sinned against, but everybody sins against God, and He is the one that truly has the right to condemn us all, and yet He will willingly forgive us all. But He wants us to forgive others as well. If you're not a Christian, the Bible says, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. You need to do that. Or if you're a child of God and you've wandered away, you've not been the example that you ought to be, or you need the prayers of the church just because you're struggling, we invite you to come as we stand and sing together.